Gonna have a good video today, at least I'm gonna try, cause truth is my ankle hurts cause I sprained it on Tuesday. Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, and my preferences. And there's a point in the knitting, often, where you get this overwhelming sense of joy because you're like, I have reached the final row. Yes! Yes! All I have to do is bind off and I am finished. Yes! Okay, sure, there's finishing work to do. There's weaving in ends, there's washing, there's blocking, there's all the good stuff. But still, finishing that last row and binding off is a very satisfying moment in knitting. But, it's also a moment in knitting fraught with peril. I'm being a little dramatic, admittedly, but it's true. Often the chain bind off, there are tension problems. That last stitch can get really sloppy. So today, I'm gonna share with you my top tips for perfecting your standard bind off. If you're interested in this, make sure that you hit subscribe, the notification bell, give this video a thumbs up, and let's bind off. My area of struggle has often been, long been, the bind off. Namely, doing a really good standard bind off. Oftentimes my tension was too tight. My last stitch was too sloppy. There's a reason why I mentioned these exact two things in the introduction. The thing though is, when you have an area of struggle, it oftentimes becomes an area that you become really kind of expert in terms of all the tips and tricks to make that technique work for you. Now, I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert. Well, I kind of do claim that I'm an expert, but anyway. But I have learned some tricks and techniques that have worked well with me, so I'm excited to share them with you today. But first, let's just quickly take a look at what is the chain bind off. So I have a swatch here that to show you the chain bind off. And you start off doing just a knit stitch. All right, and then your next stitch, you knit. And here is where the chain bind off comes into play. This is stitch 1, here, stitch 2. What you do with the chain bind off is you just take stitch 1 and you pass it over stitch 2 thusly. And that's how you do the chain bind off. I'll do one more. So I'm going to knit my next stitch. And then I just, again, stitch 1, stitch 2, take my left needle, put into stitch 1, and then carefully pass that over stitch number 2. And it is a very easy, simple, straightforward bind off to do, but the struggle for me with this bind off was always getting good tension. Oftentimes my chain bind off would be too tight. Some people, the problem they run into with the chain bind off is that it's too loose. Regardless of whether your bind off is too tight or too loose, it is a tension problem. So let's take a look at some solutions on how to fix your tension problems with the chain bind off. There's lots of ways you can try to fix your tension issue, whether it's too tight or too loose. There's very simple things that you can do in terms of, as you're doing your chain bind off, making sure that you are sizing each stitch. What do I mean by that? That means so I'm going to knit this next stitch. I'm going to make sure when I do that this stitch number 2 really gets to the full barrel of the needle, to make sure this is properly sized. When I go to pass the first stitch over the second stitch, I make sure that I really kind of get into that and I lift it over and I bring it over, and I make sure when I bring it over, I again bring this stitch back to the full width of the barrel, because I just want to try to keep this stitch here as loose as I can. Not too loose, you know, but I want to, since my issue with the bind off is being too tight, I have to be careful of not accidentally getting too tight with this stitch here. I generally hate switching needle sizes. I don't know why, it's just something that bugs me. I don't like doing it for my cast-ons to fix a tension problem. I feel like, I don't know, it's just something that annoys me. But I gotta say, I get over that neuroses for the chain bind off. So in this case, this is gonna be a very strange day indeed, because I'm actually going to bring out a bamboo needle. I consider bamboo the devil material when it comes to knitting needles, but I knitted this swatch with a size 10 needle, so I need a size 11 needle to bind off, and this was the size 11 that I had within reach. So I'm going to just knit in, and then do my pass the slip stitch over. Make sure, again, that I get that stitch really on the full circumference of the barrel, so I'm properly sizing that stitch, and then I can do my next one. And this really does give me a much better bind off, just switching the needle size. If you want to know the truth, I almost never knit with straight needles unless they're DPNs. But I keep a collection of straight needles around for various reasons. One is if there's some cast-ons that work really well, work best, work at all, with a straight needle, so I like to have one on hand. The other reason that I like a straight needle is for things like this, when I need to bind off my stitches. So I want to show you, and I think you can tell, right here are the first 3 stitches that I bound off, utilizing the original size 10 needle that I knitted the swatch with. And you can see the size difference, hopefully. But like right here, these 3 stitches are noticeably smaller than these stitches up here, these chain bind offs. This is called the chain bind off, by the way, because it looks like a chain here at the top. But these slightly larger stitches match my cast-on edge much better, and it gives a little bit more elasticity to the bound off edge. One thing I don't love about this cast-on is that it doesn't have as much elasticity to it as other bind-offs do. There are other bind-offs, by the way, but it doesn't have as much elasticity, and it certainly doesn't have as much elasticity as, say, I cast it on using the long tail cast-on. You can see it has a nice bit of elasticity, and that's something you're oftentimes looking for in a cast-on. And if you want a bind-off that has sort of equal elasticity as your cast-on edge, you're just not going to get that as much with the chain bind off. You need a stretchier bind off than what the chain bind off is. But if that's not a concern for you, the chain bind off, you know, it works. It's very convenient and it's very simple to do. So I'm going to continue binding off this edge, and then I'm going to show you my trick for avoiding a sloppy loose stitch at the end. So a really common problem that can occur with almost any bind off, but particularly this one, is this last stitch here. By the time you come to bind it off, it gets stretched out and sloppy looking. And you get this loose, sloppy bind off here at the end. It happens for a few reasons. The main one tends to be that as you're binding off and there's fewer stitches, the weight of the fabric starts to pull at this stitch, and it just starts getting looser and looser. So how can you avoid this? Well, there's kind of a lot of tips and tricks to avoid it or fix it if it happens, but I'm going to show you my favorite method of avoiding getting a loose stitch all together, and it involves my favorite notion, well, one of my favorite notions, which is a locking stitch marker. I'm very picky about my stitch markers and my locking stitch markers. And I saw these for a while. And it's called a quick locking stitch marker. And frankly, I always was like, that's $2 more than the regular stitch markers, the regular Clover stitch markers. Is it really worth an extra $2? Then I got some. And shockingly, yes. 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 This is worth the little bit of extra money for this stitch marker. So yeah, I do recommend it. What I'm going to do, and this is going to be very easy for me to do right now because I'm using a circular needle. So I'm going to move this to the other end and just take this last stitch and put it on the locking stitch marker and let that hold this stitch. Okay? Like that. Now, if you're working on straights, it may not be as easy to do. Just imagine there's a knob here at the end. I will go ahead and I will put the stitch marker on that stitch before I do my bind off. And then when I get to like the last 2 or 3 stitches to bind off, I'll take my needle out real quick and then just slip it in like that. And but since I'm on circulars, I can just do it right away. One of the reasons I like working on circulars over straights. So I'm going to continue binding off. All right, now I'm at my last bind off. I need to bind off this stitch now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a crochet hook. And I want to get a crochet hook. It doesn't have to be the exact size of my needle, but it needs to be kind of like within the same range. This is a size 11 US. It's an 8mm needle. This is a 6mm crochet hook. This will be plenty large enough to do this. I've put this stitch here on my crochet hook. I'm going to pull this up a little bit by the locking stitch marker and put my crochet hook through there. And then I'm going to just bind off this last stitch by using the crochet hook to grab the yarn and pull it through both those stitches like that. Then I'm going to just pull this, break the yarn. There we go. And then I can just pull this out like this. Doop, doop. And my last bind off is done. And I have a lovely, well-tensioned, good even tension on my bind off. And look how lovely and tidy that last stitch is. Let me take that off so you can really see. Like this last stitch is not like loose and sloppy. It's a really lovely chain bind off. That are 2 great tips on perfecting your chain bind off. But there are others because frankly, you don't need to utilize knitting needles at all to do a chain bind off. You can just use a crochet hook. And I'm going to show you that next. If you are familiar with crochet, you might look at the edge of this bind off and think, wow, that looks a lot like a slip stitch chain. And you would not be wrong. This is essentially structurally the same as a slip stitch chain that you see in crochet all the time. So why not just use a crochet hook to do your bind off? And quite frankly, I really like utilizing a crochet hook for a slip stitch bind off for a couple reasons. I think it's faster. I think it's easier to get good tension on it. And a lot of times when I utilize a chain bind off, it's because I'm dealing with a splittier yarn. And I think it's easier to deal with that splittier yarn with a crochet hook than with knitting needles. So here's how you do it. The stitches are still going to be on the needle. And I'm going to leave this last stitch here actually the way it is because I think utilizing my crochet hook, I will avoid that sloppy last stitch regardless. So, but we'll see, we'll see. Now, admittedly, if you're not used to crocheting or if you are not a continental knitter, if you're an English style knitter like myself, utilizing this technique might feel a little awkward because you are going to want to hold the yarn in your left hand. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this first stitch and I'm going to go into it with my crochet hook as if to knit like I would. It's just I'm going to use a crochet hook instead. So here's stitch number 1 on my crochet hook. Now, what I'm going to do though is different. Instead of knitting into this stitch and then passing the first stitch over the second stitch, I'm going to use my crochet hook and go into the stitch as if to knit. Then I'm going to grab the working yarn with the crochet hook, pull that through the stitch on my needle, and then I'm going to use my crochet, oops, okay, try again. I'm going to use my crochet hook to pull the new stitch through the stitch on the crochet hook. Let's look at this in slow-mo. I'll use my crochet hook to enter the stitch as if to knit, grab the working yarn, and pull that through, and then I'll use my crochet hook to pull the new stitch through the stitch on the crochet hook. So there's no slipping the stitch over when you utilize a crochet hook like this. And I think this really helps kind of deal with the tension issues that can happen. Now, one thing about utilizing a crochet hook, just like with the knitting needle, you do want to make sure that you bring the loop of yarn to the full circumference of the barrel to size the stitches properly. But you can see how quickly this goes by utilizing the crochet hook as opposed to utilizing your knitting needles. This is one of the reasons I always like to have crochet hooks in my notions bag. You don't have to have a full set. In fact, I have double-ended repair crochet hooks in my notions bag, and they come in a small, a medium, and a large, and I could have just used my large crochet hook to do this, but there we go. And again, just pull this through, and voila, I have a beautiful, beautiful chain bind off utilizing a crochet hook. This is my favorite way actually to do the chain bind off. And you know, the tension is gorgeous. It matches perfectly. It's really consistent throughout. You know, sometimes with chain bind offs, usually utilizing knitting needles, my bind off, it gets a little uneven. It gets a little sloppy at times for various reasons, but with a crochet hook, never have that problem. I have one last tip to share with you on the chain bind off and how to make a great bind off. That is not to use the chain bind off. There are so many bind offs. There's so many bind offs. You don't have to use the chain bind off. You can find other methods and get results that look exactly like a chain bind off. Now, I think that it's really worth understanding how to do a chain bind off and how to do it really well, because it is the basis for a lot of other bind offs. But the fact of the matter is, there's so many bind offs out there, you don't have to utilize the chain bind off or the standard bind off as your bind off. Holy crap. I would not do shots every time I say bind off. You will be in trouble. Oh my gosh. So I have done in the past a video on utilizing what's called the decrease bind off to end your project, and I'm going to demonstrate a new way that I am now doing it. That video is fine. It has fine advice in it, but I think I now have a better way even of doing the decrease bind off, so I wanted to share that with you today. So let's look at utilizing a decrease bind off in place of a standard bind off. So the decrease bind off starts off relatively the same as a decrease bind off in that we are going to just knit a stitch. Now what I'm going to do is, instead of knitting this next stitch, I'm going to slip this stitch as if to knit, like this. And now I'm going to do an SSK. Well, I'm basically doing an SSK. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my left needle and I'm going to bring it into the first stitch and the second stitch here on my right needle and do a knit two together like that. And this is a left leaning knit two together that I just did. Now I'm going to take this stitch, I'm going to slip that as if to knit, and then I'm going to do this knit two together. Thusly, slip as if to knit. I really enjoy this bind off. If you know how to do a SSK, you can do this bind off very easily, very quickly. I think it's easier to get good tension utilizing this bind off. Now, as I'm doing this, one thing I'm doing is I am making sure that I I keep the stitches loose. Sometimes what I'll do, even with this type of bind off, is I won't just bring the stitch to the full circumference of the needle, but I also pull it a little bit just to make it a little looser. Just to make sure this stitch that I just made stays nice and loose as I'm working. There is my decrease bind off all complete, and you can see structurally this looks just the same. Oops, let me turn this upside down. There we go. Structurally, this looks exactly the same, once again, as the chain bind off that I utilized with my knitting needles. It looks exactly the same. In fact, I think I even got the tension almost exactly the same. Gimme. It's just how I'm going, and structurally, it is the same. It's just how I'm going about getting this chain is different. So there you have it. Those are my top tips for doing some kind of chain bind off. I would love to hear from you. What are your favorite bind offs? These were just some examples on how to do a standard bind off, utilizing a crochet hook, going up a needle size, utilizing the decrease bind off. I love to hear about what your favorite bind offs are. What are your tips and tricks? How do you get great tension? You know, I'm one person. I do not know everything. I would love for us as a community to come together and share our knowledge with one another, because I learn things from you guys all the time. So let me know down in the comments below. Also, you know, the fact of the matter is, commenting on videos, liking videos, hitting that thumbs up lets YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out. So more crafters, knitters, find this space and we can help grow this community, because it is, I'm just overwhelmed all the time by all the people who have taken some time of their life to spend with me and interact with me on the channel, who show up either live during Knit Tea Live or watch the replays and comment. We've had amazing conversations, and if you never want to miss a live stream or an update, all you got to do is subscribe and hit the notification bell. Make sure your YouTube notifications are on and you will not miss a live stream. Also, you can follow me on social media. You can find all my social media down in the description box and follow me there to keep up to date with whatever is happening with Carrie CraftGeek and learn more about my world. Also, I now have a community tab. Yes, when you reach 1,000 subscribers, you get a community tab. So that's been fun. There are polls up that you can participate in. You can comment. I put announcements up there about upcoming videos. So keep an eye on the community tab. You know how you can keep an eye on the community tab? Make sure it shows up in your feed on your own little home, YouTube home world. Hit subscribe and the notification bell. Yes, I gotta get those plugs in. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy knitting. Bye!